In general, in the US you can vote if you're 18, you're a US citizen, and if you live in the state that you're voting in. Obviously, these terms vary a little bit from state to state, but the main idea remains the same. All adult Americans have the right to vote. This was not always true. Before the 1980s, the widespread disenfranchisement of African Americans was still very common. Before 1920, women couldn't vote at all. Before the progressive movement, our vote was still public and it was easy for political machines to coerce voters into voting for them. Before 1865, African Americans couldn't vote. Before 1830, most states only allowed you to vote if you had a certain amount of property, effectively excluding all but the richest for voting. Just as society was different in 1776, so was our idea of what democracy was. As social movements influenced the nation, those who were eligible to vote changed as well. Going back to the start, we can look for why suffrage expanded at all and how demographics gaining the vote affected the future of the nation. There are a few different things societally happening all at the same time that contributed to democratization around 1800. And this democratization in turn led to more social change. Essentially, democratization and social change in America are thoroughly linked throughout the saga of American history. The first movement, which had been happening for a long time at this point, which everyone knows about from their school curriculums, is the Enlightenment. In short, this was a movement that encouraged rationalism, scientific thought, and introduced ideas about governance such as capitalism, the social contract, and natural rights. It's what put the original revolutionary fire under the colonists in 1776, and it continued to influence both the state and federal constitutions for years afterwards. The second important player when it comes to social change during this time is the Second Great Awakening. This is the most important religious movement in American history, as it gave birth to the evangelical sects of Christianity, which are so popular in America to this day. What's more important, however, is the individualist streak this movement gave to Americans across the countryside, and the multitude of social reform movements that sprouted out of the Second Great Awakening. The last important player when it came to social change in this period was the abundance of frontier spirit present in the American consciousness. That is, the desire to move west and seek new opportunity and further independence. All of these forces combined first to cause the American Revolution. Colonial restlessness as a result of the Proclamation of 1763, individualist flair added by the Second Great Awakening, and a revolutionary point of view provided by the Enlightenment came together to inspire the revolution. 40 years later, these same social forces would come together to inspire the first large wave of democratization in America, resulting in the social and political evolution of America as a whole. What is this democratization event I'm even talking about? In school, it was likely noted that around the time of Jackson, there was widespread democratization across the country. This democratization granted universally the right to vote for every white man. However, it is also likely that it was never explained why or how this happened. In between 1800 and 1856, a slow but steady shift favoring universal white male suffrage was occurring. At first, almost every state had property requirements for someone to vote. By the end, none did. Understanding what, now we must move on and ask why. I've already told you about the three most important social forces in America at this time. The reason I did that is because it is these three things which were the driving force behind the wave of democratization. Let's look first at the flashpoint for the expansion of the vote. In 1819, the U.S. economy crashed in an event known as the Panic of 1819. As with most recessions in history, this resulted in political outrage and calls for political and economic reform. This time, the primary demand was the vote for the common man, because many saw the recession as a result of the fact that only rich landowners could vote. As a result, multiple states began to expand their suffrage rights. In 1821, New York passed their revised constitution with some of these reforms. Despite failing to fully eradicate property requirements to vote, the value requirement was lowered and the definition of landowner was expanded to tax-paying tenants, serving to take early steps towards widening suffrage. However, this movement also served to further restrict African American rights by codifying further restrictions and the eventual outlawing of their suffrage. Other states enacted similar reforms, notably in the West, which often eliminated property restrictions for voting entirely. So, how did social movements cause this advancement of suffrage? As mentioned already, new Western states had the most inclusive voting policies. This is due to the fact that there was a particular frontier spirit in these states, and because there was no established landowning class to monopolize the vote. Because of this, and the individualist spirits present in these states, there was a lot of political participation from even the lower classes. The spirit of individualism was also promulgated through the influence of the Second Great Awakening. Evangelical religions and grassroots nature of the movement, similarly to the frontier culture of the day, promoted social participation from the lower classes and increased the equality of people through the shared religious beliefs of the movement. Finally, continued belief in Enlightenment ideas continued to motivate people to seek government reform. This took form earlier in violent actions such as the Whiskey Rebellion, but also manifested in movements such as this wave of democratization. The widening of the ballot had some immediate effects and many more long-term ones. The logical result of giving the vote to the common man is that the interests of the common man are better represented. Before 1820, presidents were primarily elected based on foreign policy and attitude towards the bank and executive power. After 1820, a more general voter base allows populist candidates to have a great deal of influence and charismatic leaders to win elections by their aura alone. This is most easily seen by the election of Jackson. Jackson, as a war general, used his great deal of fame to gain votes from all regions of the nation despite sectionalism beginning to dominate the political scene. On top of this, his origins from the West meant that his ideals aligned with the fiery individualism of Appalachia and the Second Great Awakening, two movements which allowed the common man to vote in the first place. Jackson as president was so influential that he helped Martin Van Buren become president in 1836 and led to the rise of the Whig Party, which originally existed only to defeat the populist influence of Jackson. However, the populist sentiment evident with Jackson's election had further consequences than just the transition from the first to the second party system in America. As Daniel Feller states in his essay about Jackson and democratization, the fact that Andrew Jackson, a rough-hewn, poorly educated, self-made frontiersman, could ascend to the presidency mattered more than the policies he embraced. His rhetorical championship of the plain people against the aristocrats, whatever its substance or sincerity, was itself the sign and harbinger of a massive social shift towards democracy, equality, and the primacy of common man. If Jackson was the start, what were the other effects of democratization? Well, after looking into it, an interesting pattern develops. As explained before, social movements played a pivotal role in the beginning of expanding suffrage. By examining the effects of this expansion, however, we can clearly see that democratization leads to the creation of new social movements and changes. This essentially leads to a cycle. Social movements contribute to democratization, which spawn new social movements, which contribute to further democratization. We'll see this pattern better later. After the common white man gained the vote throughout the 1820s and 1830s, new issues came to light. Primarily, the expansion of America westward caused a conflict of interest between homesteaders and slave owners. In having the vote, these poor farmers were able to resist the interests of the upper class by forming a political coalition with the abolitionists, the Free Soil Party. Slavery's westward expansion threatened to put the average man on the frontier out of his job. As a result, these people joined a movement that advocated for free soil, free labor, and free speech. This could never have happened without the poor white man gaining the vote. So clearly from this example, we can see that democratization helps spawn new political action and social change, just as social change spawns democratization. Looking forward, we can see further proof of this in history. After the first wave in the 1800s, democratization became the reason for and the result of multiple different movements, following the previously described pattern. As mentioned before, the Free Soil movement emerged as a natural result of the interests of the common white man in the North and West. This movement turned into the Republican Party, which helped bring about the start and end of the Civil War, and the right to vote for African Americans. Other social movements also led to democratization. The women's suffrage movement spawned out of temperance and abolitionist societies in the early 1800s. These societies, like the Free Soil Party, were aided by the fact that poor men could vote to push these issues forward. This makes sense. Once a previously disenfranchised group gets their vote, they can more effectively fight for their own and often others' rights as well. When the white working class man got the vote, they could fight to end slavery in order to reduce the competition for labor and also advocate for improved working conditions once industrialization really kicked off. Once the black man got the vote, they could more effectively fight for their rights than before, as evidenced by the civil rights movement. Once women got the vote, they could vote on women's issues like equal pay and marriage and reproductive rights more effectively. These democratization events, while certainly not being the only factors for social change, certainly contribute to America's changing society. It is important to recognize that these reform movements were slow and often made backward progress in multiple areas. Democratization in the 1800s for the white man led to disenfranchisement for the black man until the end of the Civil War. Similarly, social movements like progressivism or the temperance movement damaged the rights of immigrants. However, as Thomas Jefferson said, we do not have government by the majority. We have government by the majority who participate. Reform is pushed by those who are enfranchised. As it turns out, the fight to participate is often made up of many different social movements, which, once enfranchisement is achieved, often evolve further into movements which make up the next era of activism. Thus, this is how social movements and democratization are deeply linked, and within this pattern we can see how and why different changes occurred throughout American history. The main takeaway: your vote is powerful, and it's a gift that your ancestors probably didn't have at one point.